All right, let's get started. We're in the after lunch spot on the second day. So who's awake? Ish? I know. Yesterday, this time slot, the speaker I was watching had everybody do the wave to see if they're waking up. I'm not going to do that to you, but I do want to make sure that we're awake and also get a sense of where y'all are coming from. So who here, raise your hand, you are already working, you're working on the front end, you're doing HTML, CSS, or design of some sort? Pretty much everybody. Nobody's aspirational, trying to figure out if they get in, or managing those folks? Okay. A couple of those. Okay, great. So the folks who raised their hand, you're hiring them. Next question. Who here has heard of and knows what ZURB Foundation is? Most of you. Pretty good. Who's using it every day? Once again, those of you who are managing or that sort of folks, those are the folks you want to look up and hire. Okay. So our talk today, we're going to talk about Foundation, and we're going to talk about what it is and how it enables you to develop in a highly productive, effective way, all the way from prototype to production. So first off, I'm Kevin. I'm from ZURB. ZURB is a design company. We're based in Campbell, California, out near the heart of the valley, but actually a little southwest, so we don't have to deal with as much stuff. And we are primarily product designers. We work with companies large and small. We do trainings, we do consulting, and all sorts of things. But we also are the body behind Foundation and the Foundation family of frameworks. So there's a couple different things that we do. We've been doing Foundation, the web framework, for 5 years now. We do Foundation for email, which is making HTML emails less crappy. And those of you who are longtime Foundation fans may notice there used to be another member of this family, which is Foundation for apps. We did an experiment early on when Angular started coming out. Something like this. It's very, I hear it. Thank you. Very rough around the edges, but it gets the idea across. It's for experimenting quickly. Once you move into production, it's much more polished. So let's talk a little bit about prototyping with Foundation with that sort of thing in mind. So we've got these 3 points: low fidelity, quick iteration, optimized for development speed. Talking about, starting with low fidelity, one of the big opinions that Foundation makes that is different than you might see with a Bootstrap or a Material or Semantic UI or something like that is that we start with a very wireframe-like visual. This lets you move quickly and not be distracted by what's going on here. You can see the main point of what you're doing, and it lets you kind of almost move some of your wireframing process rapidly around into code. And so when you start building a site, our process at ZURB, we scaffold it out. We don't worry about how it's going to look like first because you're trying to get that high-level structure in place and make sure that's actually what you want before you start layering on level after level of fidelity. In terms of quick iteration, quick iteration is not just for prototyping because, as you've probably seen, like once you do something, people always want to change it, and that never really stops. But as you move forward, you're going to iterate, you're going to iterate, you're going to iterate. You've got to have ways to change things quickly. And some of the ways that we support that with Foundation, we consolidate all sorts of different CSS settings into a single Sass file. So you can retheme, in many ways, your site just by changing a couple of different variables. So as you're going along, you're iterating, somebody says, well, wouldn't it be great if our spacing was just a little bit larger? Or wouldn't it be great if we tried with this other color palette? You can actually make those changes in one place and see them immediately represented across your entire site. And we ship Foundation with a prototyping stack. We call it the ZURB stack. That is what we use in-house for all of our design-related projects. That comes with a bunch of stuff optimized for rapid prototyping. So it's got a static site generator. That includes support for variables, partials, layouts, that sort of thing. Builds in browser sync, has a super rapid build time, just kind of ideal for this rapid prototyping process that you want early on. And it's optimized for development speed. We've got a built-in responsive grid, super easy to use. You're building something from the beginning. You can do interactivity without JavaScript. So anything that you might want to experiment with, a common UI pattern, in this case, a modal dialog, you can implement it straight from the HTML. You don't have to jump into JavaScript. You don't have to figure out how it's going to interact. Over 30 different components built that way such that when you're prototyping, you can be in there without having to dig deep. You don't have to think too much about it. So what about production, right? Like a lot of those things are what you want when you're prototyping, but do they scale? Like, I've got this product, I've just prototyped it, I haven't touched the JavaScript. How am I going to actually make this a real application? How am I going to take this and put it out and work with my dev team, whoever I might, if I'm a designer, or hand it off to the back end? How is it going to talk? So let's talk a little bit about that. You don't want to have to throw this stuff away from scratch because you've just done a ton of learning as you went along. Looking back at those 4 key points around production, what are we looking for? High fidelity, stable, highly customized, and optimized for end user speed. So let's dig into those. In terms of high fidelity and digging in, you can create any sort of semantic styling using Foundation. So Foundation, a lot of folks' first experience with Foundation, they're like applying the basic classes, the built-in classes that we ship with, similar to how you would with another framework of any sort. But we actually build every single class that we ship in Foundation from a Sass mixin, such that you don't have to use any of the class names that we do. In fact, I saw recently a production site launch using Foundation who switched all the way over into BEM-style class names. And they're doing everything there. And what they do is they build using the mix-ins rather than taking the classes out of the box. So once you're moving from prototype to production, you don't want to have 20 different class names that you've layered on to get different effects. You want to customize down your class names to be semantic and be specific. You just start building those out of mix-ins rather than trying to layer on built-in classes. We also come with accessibility baked in. So as you move from prototype to production, you care about not just can I pull out my phone and play with this thing, but can people interact with it? ADA requirements are starting to come in and be looming, and there's legal decisions happening. But even without that, there's 54 million people in the US with a disability of some sort. So if you don't make your site accessible to alternate ways of accessing it, you're going to lose a huge amount of your audience. Accessibility is no longer something that we can just ignore in the web as we're getting to wider and wider audiences. Multi-device means not just phone, not just laptop, not just iPad, but screen readers and all sorts of other. Maybe somebody doesn't use a mouse. They're using a laptop, but they have to do completely keyboard access. This is super important in today's world when you go into production and you're looking at a large audience. And from a developer standpoint, it's still kind of a niche discipline. Most developers have no idea how to make their site ADA compliant. So Foundation, with all those components I mentioned that come out of the box, we bake in accessibility from the start so that you can put these things in, they're accessible as they interact, they go, and once you start layering on top, you have that still at your base level. In terms of stability, I mentioned this thing has been around for 5 years. It's battle tested. We use it every day at ZURB. This came out of our own dog fooding of what we're doing. But this is happening all over the world. We've got major organizations using it. There's over 1 million different people who've come in and played with Foundation in some form or another. There's hundreds of the top 10,000 sites built on this thing. So this thing has been through the ringer. And when you are ready to go to production with your application, you want something that's been through the ringer and that has all those bugs squeezed out. Making things more highly customized, one of the things that's core to the Foundation framework is that it is extensible. We have a well-defined component architecture for both the CSS components and the JavaScript components. So you can plug into those components. If you're talking, for example, about a JavaScript component, you can not only customize all of their behavior via different options, you can call things from JavaScript as well as the HTML. We also have events that are triggered all of the time. So if you want to plug this into a larger framework, just add a couple event listeners, start digging to it. The goal of Foundation is to be foundational. It's not intended to do everything for you. It's intended to give you a very solid foundation to build on top of. And that's why we take some of these approaches like the bare bones styles out of the box and things like that. So with some frameworks, you may start and have something that looks a little bit more polished out of the box. And then as you move into production, you take out this piece, and you override this piece, and you move this around. And before you know it, you've undone half of your framework to try to get to your custom approach. Foundation is built to be exactly that, a foundation. It makes it much easier to build that custom on top of it. And for that reason, it can take that bridge from prototype to production in kind of a flying manner. And finally, optimizing for end user speed rather than development speed. This is where some of that modularity really comes in. So Foundation's components are designed to be highly modular, and we include them in a modular way when you do a build. So you've got all these different modules that when you're prototyping, you just say, OK, throw them all in. Let's start. Let's do the max build everything in there, because I don't know what I'm going to use, and I don't want to deal with it. Go, 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 go. As you start to move into production, you've got that more pinned down. You're saying, OK, I know I'm using modals, and I know I'm using drop-downs, but accordions, that doesn't fit my style, and I don't need this piece. I don't need that piece. You pick out and include only the components you need, and suddenly, instead of shipping a framework that is CSS and JavaScript over 100K, you can trim it down till it's effectively only what you need. And you've got a much more lightweight. And on top of that, it's fast. We're using a ton of different modern tricks. We're optimizing our CSS. We're optimizing our JavaScript, optimizing the event handling to make this thing wicked fast to interact with and highly performant on mobile and desktop. So I would argue that not only should you be using a framework from prototype but all the way to production, but that it's actually more important than ever. And I have a few different reasons why I believe that is so, starting with the rise of design. So design star is rising. There was a 2014 study that found that design-led companies outperformed the S&P 500 by over 200%. And then they took out Apple because Apple is Apple. And they said, OK, how much does it without Apple if you don't include them? And found it was still over 58%. Even enterprise software companies are starting to have to invest in design because the entire business model, the way that enterprise software is sold, has shifted. It used to be consumer companies worry about design, and enterprise companies, they go and talk to the CIO and tell him all the bullet points and show him a spreadsheet, and he buys it. And the employees have to deal. But that doesn't happen in the same way anymore. You have things like Slack and Asana and all these things that are coming in from the bottom up. And so design is increasingly important across your entire business. And so when you have design and development, your ideal is you have the design working on something, and it interfaces beautifully with the developer, and you have this nice yin and yang going on. And the problem is there's actually often a gap, and your design and development interaction starts looking more like this, where you've got the designers over on one side talking to users and doing things and doing all sorts of things, and the development is like, no, we can't build that. What are you talking about? Foundation is attempting to bridge this gap. So Foundation is a software framework that is built by a design company and by designers around the world, as well as developers, with an understanding of design. And where this comes from is that we believe that design is something that you should be doing in the medium, right? So if you were designing for the web, you should be understanding HTML, CSS. Ooh, what just happened? You should be understanding HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You don't have to be an expert, but you need to be designing in the medium. Just like if you were designing for print, you damn well better have some paper on your desk that you're playing with and understanding what does this feel like and look like. So what we are seeing, at least at ZURB and with other companies we've worked for, is that Foundation creates a common language between design and development. It lets you talk about things in a component way that somebody who's on the sort of design part of the organization can say, OK, so here's this thing I'm thinking, and it's called this, because they're using Foundation and understanding Foundation. The developer says, oh, I see that. I see where that is in my JavaScript. I know how I can plug into that, and really create this bridge from design to development so you get things moving piece to piece. Another reason why I believe using a framework like Foundation is more important than ever is the speed of change. So y'all are at a conference like this. You know how hard it is to keep up with things. You're out here trying to learn. Right, how many tracks do we have here? There's like 16 tracks. I was at the bar last night, and I was like, so tell me about the talks you went to, because I wanted to go to that one, and 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 I could go to one in each slot. And this is not unique to this conference. This is the industry, right? You can focus, even just focusing on JavaScript. Who here thinks they can keep up with everything going on in JavaScript? Right? I mean, it's ridiculous. And you've got to understand JavaScript. You've got to understand what's going on in the HTML standards bodies. You've got to understand where's CSS going, and should I do my animations in CSS, or should I use request animation frame, or what about the web animations UI? Like, the speed of change in this industry is ridiculous. And what using a framework like Foundation lets you do is lean on the community out there. So I'm using Foundation. I'm leading the Foundation project. I don't have to worry about all of those things. I just have to worry about, do I know somebody who's worrying about each of those domains? Are they involved with the project? Are they helping push it forward? We have folks submitting changes from all across the world, and that lets you keep up to some extent with the speed of change and keep up with best practices, because best practices are evolving constantly. So by incorporating a foundation or another framework, though I would obviously advocate for Foundation, it lets you keep up with best practices like mobile-first development. Folks use phones to access the web more than ever. And who here has tried to take a desktop site and redesign it for mobile? How well did that work? Flip it around and you say, OK, take this mobile app and figure out how to make that work on a desktop. You can add a few layers. It's way easier to start thinking about your experience and create a coherent experience that actually works if you start from the smaller device up. And this was an idea that Luke Grabulski put forward not even that long ago, 3 years, 4 years, something like that. And Foundation was the first framework to implement it. But this totally changes the way that you approach your development. I may be dating myself, but I remember being super excited about Grid 960 came out, and I'm like, OK, I have a grid. I don't have to worry about how am I laying things out and dealing with all of that. And for a long time, I was thinking about things in that world, and it just made doing the web on a phone really painful. And you end up doing multiple versions of the same site and doing all these different things. When you start thinking about a responsive framework and you start from this mobile first, it becomes so much easier to think about that and create an integrated experience across all of that. SaaS. We had a talk, one of the keynotes, touching on SaaS. If you're not using SaaS, anybody not using SaaS? That's amazing. Nobody raised their hands. Everyone here is using SaaS. So I don't need to sell you on SaaS. But if you are just sort of using it a little bit, if you're using the, you're like, OK, I'm using this. I'm going to do some selector nesting. And that's already amazing because goodness gracious, CSS before you could do nesting was a pain in the butt. You should check out what this enables, right? The fact that you have essentially a first-class programming language here to deal with your styles is incredibly powerful. So you can not only deal with mix-ins and variables, but you can write entire functions to do stuff. So you can do all sorts of crazy logic. And if you're starting to learn on that, this is where the open source side of Foundation is awesome. Just go dig into the code. There's a lot of fun stuff going on that you can do in SaaS. You can bring into your own projects, do other things. Accessibility, we mentioned that. It's something that you've got to be doing. If you're not already doing that for your websites, you really should be looking forward because you're missing out on a surprisingly large audience. And even for people who are not differently abled, being able to navigate with a keyboard. I mean, I'm an old school hacker, so anytime I have to go to my mouse is like lost productivity, right? Like I live in my terminal and doing all this other stuff. So making your site accessible to the keyboard actually opens up a whole another range of things that you can do with. ECMAScript 2016. So we are, JavaScript just turned 21. It's ready to go out and party. There's so much going on in this ecosystem right now. And you guys are at All Things Open. So this is actually, I'm guessing, not a challenge for you individually. But many organizations are still slow to get on that train. And they're like, OK, so there's all this change going on. And I've got to add a build step to my front end. And what is this going on? So leaning on a framework, you can get that for free. You get the build system set up. Everything's already working, things like that. So you can bring these things in quickly without having to go through that whole learning curve. And then you can layer whatever level of development you have already on it. Another big thing that you get out of working with a framework is highly performant event listeners, or at least with Foundation. So this is something where the JavaScript world has moved in this direction, right? First, React put this where they discovered that there's a few things that make the web slow. One of the things that React does is all the shadow DOM stuff, and that's really cool and exciting. But one of their bigger innovations was actually event listening and discovering that when you have independent components that are each adding an event listener to the DOM, it slows things down a lot. And so you can get much better performance by putting a single unified listener on the page and then using JavaScript to distribute it to all the appropriate places and working down that way. React started this. And then I think the next folks to hop on the train were Ember, and then Angular got in on it, and all of the advanced JavaScript started doing that. And Foundation, we're looking more at folks who are not, well, I shouldn't say that. We are working with all these different frameworks, but we are also looking at the folks who are just writing vanilla JavaScript for one reason or another, whether it be legacy or it's unnecessary to go to that level of complexity. But this is a big innovation. And so when you talk about performance, being able to run all of your events stuff through a single listener and then piping off through JavaScript is huge. And so one of the things that you get by pulling in Foundation is you can take advantage of that without having to worry about, how do I pull that out of Angular and get that to work for me here? So we're talking about all these different things. I can talk at you all day about stories about how we're using it, but the proof is in the pudding with regards to Foundation and production. There are major brands building their sites on Foundation. Brands like NBA.com just did a relaunch. And of course, I'm a developer. I look at it, I'm like, you've still got a bug here and a bug here, and what's going on with that? But stepping back, it's pretty cool to have an open source project that you have things like NBA, Disney, GM, Adobe. All of these major brands are building on top of Foundation and launching production sites with it. So I'm wrapping up a little fast here, but I would say that if you have not, for all of you who are not working on Foundation day to day, join the insanity, start building your websites on a solid foundation, and I will happily accept any questions. Yes, sir.
So I know you talked a lot about the kind of separating out the design aspect of it, which I think is a great approach, and I absolutely love it from my point of view. Has there been any thought or conversation around maybe an abstracted design layer that ZURB does for those of us who have to sell HTML, CSS frameworks to people who don't know what they are?
That is a great question, and actually, that's something that I hear over and over again. And I'm actually the first person with an engineering background to be the lead on Foundation. At this point, it's always been designers who are like, why would you need that? You just build your design, and it's there. So yes, there's actually an active conversation going on with the Foundation core team, which I don't want to oversell the amount that ZURB is doing this. ZURB is backing this project. However, we have a core team of, there's 2 or 3 Zerbians who are on it, and then 8 different folks around the world who are not involved with ZURB except through Foundation working on it. So there's an active discussion right now about how we create essentially this concept of themes, right? Where you take the base layer, but then for folks who are design challenged, which I will actually put myself in that bucket as well, you can just pass around. Here's my take on it. Here's my design. Here's something that looks polished and beautiful out of the box. So yes. Yeah, absolutely. In the back.
One of the things that I did, we're very anti-AWIG. Everything should be custom coded. I love Foundation though. I found Foundation to be a lot more modular than Bootstrap in the past. So for example, I strip the grid out of Foundation and I use that grid in my site. Now the rest of it's custom and I'm going to take a piece of it. But I found it to be so much more modular than anything else.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes, sir.
There have been pretty big changes between versions of Foundation, right? What do you expect if you can look into the future for how long it's going to take till the next version of Foundation comes kind of upgrade?
That's a great question. So to repeat the question, there have been large changes between releases in the past, and looking forward, when is the next one going to be, and how hard is it going to be upgraded, and things like that. So Foundation 6 came out about a year ago. And I don't mind saying that the launch was a little bit flubbed. There was definitely, some stuff dropped in terms of the migration and a couple of different things. Foundation 6 was a complete rebuild for a couple of reasons. One was to bake in accessibility from the ground up. We found we were trying to layer accessibility onto Foundation 5 and hit a wall as to how far we could go without totally breaking compatibility. And so we said, okay, that and a couple other things, like let's start from fresh so that we can actually have these things that are important baked in from the front. I don't think Foundation 7 is going to be that type of rewrite. So Foundation, looking forward, there's a few different areas that we're going that I think are going to be super exciting and powerful. So one of the big areas that we're doing rework is around this concept of themes and building blocks and stuff like that. So we very much want Foundation to be foundational, but we also know that it's really helpful to have something that is much more prepackaged, that you can pull things out. So figuring out how we can walk that line and have something that is still foundational but lets you install a theme, install a couple things that somebody's built that are, I've put together these 3 components in this way to create a mega menu, and that should be something that I can just drag and drop and plug into my project. It picks up all my settings and rolls. So there's stuff coming in that direction. Another big area that I'm personally super excited about and we're exploring a lot is how to better support different types of animation. Animation is an area in the web that in some ways is utilized and because it's hard. And we've put some level of that into Foundation 6 using Motion UI, where you can have just kind of animations in and out between states. But that's barely scratching the surface of what's possible with animation. And especially as you get into mobile, having just subtle little hints about how things interact is super important, because people aren't just going to click everywhere. You need little pieces to make your UI more intuitive. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we're kind of banding around and exploring around how we can make animation something that is just as easy to do as with taking the JavaScript components that we have now and making those super easy and accessible. Yes, sir. That's a great question. So we are. So the question is, are we being as careful with supporting mix-in backwards compatibility as we are with classes? The answer is yes. We actually, for SAS mix-ins, it's easier to do things like deprecation warnings and stuff like that. So we're doing that. We're jumping pretty hard into semantic versioning. So making sure that as much as possible, and of course problems happen and mistakes happen, but as much as possible, patch versions don't require any sort of upgrade or changes in terms of API. Minor versions can do some amount, and then massive breaking changes would require a major version upgrade. I think, from actually to go back just a little bit into the question about the upgrade feature, what's going to force a 7.0 is 2 things. We're going to eventually strip out the jQuery dependency and make everything fully native ES 2016, and that is kind of a pretty big breaking change in a lot of ways. I think there will still be a jQuery integration, obviously, but that's going to force probably a major version. The other thing that we're looking at is going more firmly into either BEM or SMAX, which, for those who aren't as familiar, these are standards for highly, how would you describe it? Highly effective CSS. CSS that doesn't run into specificity issues and things like that. We're already pretty close to SMAX, but there's a few places where we're not quite there, and that would also force some of that. But we are highly observant to backwards compatibility. We burned ourselves with 6, and that, to be blunt, that release happened the week I joined ZURB. So I came in and we're like, oh my gosh, everything's on fire. How do we get this thing back under control? But because of that, yeah, we're paying very close attention to backwards compatibility as we go. Yes, sir. Yes, great question. So the question is, what happened with Foundation for Apps and what are we doing with it going forward? So Foundation for Apps, just as a quick review, was an experiment we did building an Angular integration, and we built it right after Angular started getting big. And we learned some interesting things from that. There's actually some really interesting components that are in there that are not yet in Foundation for Sites. But one of the things that we learned is that we should not be picking winners. That was started when Angular started to get big, but now you have Angular getting big, you have React getting big, you have Ember getting big, you have Polymer going on, you have all these different high-end JavaScript frameworks. I'm hearing more and more about Vue.js. That is not, we shouldn't be picking a winner, right? Like, that's not the bread and butter of Foundation, and it kind of goes against this concept of being foundational. So the way forward, what we've done is we've taken Foundation for Apps, and actually this week we're moving it into our playground as something that is fun to play with and interesting, but not one of the production products that we're pushing at ZURB. There is a community fork of it that folks are playing with, so if you're excited about it, there is still some development going on there. But what we're focusing on is taking the pieces of that worked, pulling them into Foundation for Sites, and then working to make what we have with Foundation for Sites more easy to integrate across all of the different frameworks. So there's already community ports for Angular 1.5, Ember, and React of Foundation 6, where I'm talking with various folks about building an Angular 2 version. I think there should be a Polymer port. I think there should be Vue.js ports, all of these different things. So figuring out how we go from a world where we're trying to think about one app framework and instead just have this concept of Foundation everywhere, where Foundation is something that you can use to handle your visual layer. And potentially, especially as we move into more native JavaScript, I think some of the utilities will be of use. One of the things that's really challenging right now as you go into those other frameworks is coming back like accessibility. Most folks who are building an Angular app or an Ember app or a React app aren't thinking that much about the accessibility of the app that they're building. And so if we can find a way to make the accessibility pieces that are built into Foundation JavaScript right now super simple to access from each of those different frameworks so that people can be building in high-end application frameworks and still be accessible from the ground up, that's definitely a direction we want to go. So to make it short, we don't want to be picking winners. We think Foundation should be a thing that goes everywhere and that we work with the community to build Angular ports, Ember ports, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, rather than building one ourselves. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Any thoughts or plans around maybe open sourcing or releasing the Yeti app?
That's a great question. So the question is, what's going on with Yeti launch, if I were to put that back to you. So Yeti launch was another one of those things that, for those who don't know, it was a desktop app built with, shoot, I'm blanking on the name, but whatever it is that wraps up Node apps for desktop. And it was released at the same time as Foundation 6 as a part of that sort of fire alarm launch. And it was really, how do I say this? Coming in as an engineer and then digging into the code base, I was sadly disappointed in exactly what it was and how it was built. The core concept there of making what is essentially a front-end build system something that's much more accessible to folks who don't have development environments is really powerful. And it's something that I think we're going to do potentially an iteration on as we have time and resources. The app itself there tried to do way too much. It tried to be both the build system and an editor and a whole bunch of other stuff, and it totally fell flat and did not work up to our quality standards. And so we've pulled it. We're not shipping it or advertising it or anything anymore. In terms of should we open source that, we thought about it. We went back and forth. And I will just say that, once again, as an engineer looking at that, I'm not confident that that is actually the right way to move forward on that application. Any other questions? Well, awesome. We are now out of time. Thank you to everyone for coming, and hopefully it was helpful.